In the year 1500, the continent of Europe was poised to leave the Middle Ages behind and enter a brave new chapter of history. The decades that followed can now be seen as the birth of our own modern age. It was a time of discovery, both geographically and intellectually. In art, the spirit of the Renaissance flourished, especially in the great cities of Italy. It was a time when reason and science began to take over from superstition and myth, and Europe would never be the same again. As the 16th century began, the old way of life still persisted, both here in Italy and across the Alps in northern Europe. In the Netherlands, as elsewhere, the medieval spirit still determined much of everyday life, and it was this that inspired one of the most remarkable artists of all time. A man who recognized the follies of man and sought to warn against them in often horrific terms. A man whose own Christianity was mixed with the folklore of the time and expressed through his own artistic genius. This was the first of the Dutch masters, Hieronymus Bosch. The Dutch tradition of painting is one of the most enduring features in the history of Western art. For centuries, the lands of modern Holland and Belgium have been a focal point of truly great artistic achievement. By 1450, the Netherlands had already produced painters of the caliber of Rogier van der Weyden and Jan van Eyck, just two of many great artists of the age. During the 1400s and early 1500s, donor portraits and religious commissions generated work for a large number of Dutch painters whose skills were often concentrated within families. One such family lived in the city of 's-Hertogenbosch, near Antwerp, in what was then the Duchy of Brabant. We know that by the year 1431, a man named Jan van Aken became established as a painter here, and 4 of his 5 sons also became successful artists. Jan van Aken's grandson, Jeroen, became the best-known member of the family, and today we know him by the pseudonym he adopted, a name derived from that of his home city, Hieronymus Bosch. We do not know why Jeroen van Aken adopted his working title, but this lack of knowledge is not altogether surprising. Details of Bosch's life are extremely scarce. Virtually nothing about him is known for sure. Suspect he was born in Hertogenbosch around the year 1450, and it is likely he remained here all his life. We also know that he married a wealthy woman around 1480, and that he was a member of a local religious order, the Brotherhood of Our Lady. His death in 1516 completes his historical record, but beyond these few scanty details, the life of Hieronymus Bosch is almost a total mystery. It is through the concerns of his art that we must attempt to identify the concerns of his life.
He's one of those many Netherlandish painters whose birth date we don't know, and therefore we feel rather uneasy about attempting any kind of dating of the early work. We assume that he was born in 1425 or 1430, somewhere in that bracket, because the document establishing him as an artist does so at a sort of time when most are joining the Guild of St. Luke. And there's a wedding contract and a dispute with a relative by marriage and so on. These odd little things survive. And we know that he died in 1516. And that's about it. And into that, we have to fit an extraordinary body of work. Nobody has ever known how to do it, and everybody sets out to do it with absolute authority. You compare one authority with another, and nothing fits.
What we know about him is small fragments, for example, which Carl van Mander mentions in his life of him. It's a very, very short little life. I mean, it's basically 2 pages, and it tells us a few things about his technique. It tells us a few things about some works he has done, but these works haven't survived. We do not know is it even by him, because Carl van Mander wrote his text something like a bit less than 100 years after Bosch himself had died.
By the mid-1470s, Hieronymus Bosch was active as an artist, and his earliest surviving works reveal artistic concerns that would also feature in his greatest work. Like many of the painters of the time, the young Bosch turned to the Bible for his subject matter, as we can see with this panel illustrating the wedding feast at Cana. St. John's Gospel describes the wedding feast at Cana as the setting for one of Christ's best-known miracles, the turning of water into wine. In Bosch's painting, the welcome consequences of the miracle can be clearly seen, as can the divine figure of Christ himself. But this is not an overwhelmingly spiritual image. A strong sense of flawed humanity reveals itself, with symbolism contributing strongly to the effect. Bosch's contemporaries would have immediately recognized the spitting swan as a symbol of sexual promiscuity, and the presence of the magician reminds modern viewers that many medieval folk had faith in more than just the power of Christ. In 15th century Europe, belief in magic was a widespread phenomenon, and Bosch chose to address the subject in paintings such as The Conjurer, also from early in his career. Here we witness a scene whose message is more immediate than that of the Cana wedding. A conjurer apparently produces a frog from the mouth of a man whose faith in the power of magic is comically obvious. But the conjurer has no real magic powers. Instead, he is a trickster who uses the frog as a cunning ploy to distract attention, while his accomplice picks the pocket of the mesmerized man. We can still appreciate the humor of this painting, because the foolishness of men did not die out with the Middle Ages. Many of Bosch's study of human folly express sentiments still relevant today, although the immediate subject matter can often be obscure. This small panel provides an example. What is illustrated here is a bizarre medical phenomenon often referred to in medieval Dutch folklore. Stupidity was thought to be cured by removing the so-called stone of folly from the head. Although the idea of the stone of folly had no scientific basis whatever, many people believed in it, and it is easy for us to laugh at the misplaced faith of this gullible medieval patient. However, we cannot be honest and claim that our own times are entirely free from strange beliefs. It may be that future generations will laugh at present-day practices such as astrology or palm reading. We cannot tell how our own age will come to be regarded. What we can recognize is that there is a timeless element to Bosch images such as this. The artist is revealing himself as a man who is, undoubtedly, the product of his own contemporary world. But he is also outside of that world, an artist who holds up a mirror to the follies of men. We can therefore see Hieronymus Bosch as following in an enduring literary tradition, a fool whose wisdom is ultimately greatest of all.
Around that time there was a tradition in writing and art about the human beings all being fools. There was The Ship of Fools by Sebastian Brandt, which Bosch probably knew. It was translated into other languages. It was actually published in 1494 in Basel. And he himself paints a ship of fools, and there you've got the fool sitting in the rigging, and the whole boat is peopled by intoxicated men and women, and centre stage actually are a nun and a monk, so he's actually attacking, you know, the church in that way as well. And there was also a proverbial boat in the Netherlands called the Blue Boat, which was always peopled by everybody drunk.
The humour of Hieronymus Bosch is often easily understood, but his widespread use of contemporary symbols is less easy for the modern viewer to appreciate. We may never know what the artist's intentions were when he decided to place a funnel upon the head of this bogus surgeon, while the significance of the book on the nun's head is also obscure. Bosch's regular use of arcane symbolism is a difficulty that faces the modern student of his art. But it is not the only difficulty. Significantly, Bosch chose not to date his works. This means that we cannot be sure when he created images like Ship of Fools, another highly symbolic scene of human self-indulgence and folly.
I think it's very difficult to actually fix a chronology, and nobody is quite certain. So usually his works are divided into three periods, kind of loose periods, starting in 1474 to about 1485, and then to 1510, and the last one to his death in 1516. Because the thing is, a lot of his paintings have been overpainted, and there's been quite a lot of damage as well. So it's quite difficult even to detect, you know, the technical ways of his painting. Quite often he uses very thin paint, as was that's one of the characteristics of his work. And if we're taking it at a very simple level, one can probably say, in answer to the chronology, that he did a very simple depiction of hell in the Seven Deadly Sins, the tabletop, and it's become much more sophisticated in the Hell Wing, in the Garden of Earthly Delights. So the one is considered to be earlier than the other.
If you write down the chronology proposed by Tournai and Baldas and any other expert, and compare them, they make absolutely no sense. They're not really within reach of each other. It seems to me that you must do a number of slightly experimental things. You take the early work, or what we presume to be the early work, and compare it with what was happening in the Netherlands, what we know what was happening in the Netherlands in the work of other painters. And you will find that there are parallels. There are ways of constructing figures, there are ways of dealing with perspective, there are ways of distorting pictorial space, which are common to a whole host of not very good painters.
The efforts of art historians have established how the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch evolved throughout his working life. But some aspects of his art were with him from the beginning. These include the keen humour and strong symbolism that we have already seen. The follies of man would also be a recurring element of his work. As well as folly, Bosch also concerned himself with the darker business of sin and the terrible punishments that lay in store for the sinner. The paintings produced from this preoccupation with sin would revolutionize the world of art forever. Nothing like it had ever been seen before, and no artist has ever matched Bosch's unique vision of hell and damnation. The impact of these scenes remains as strong today as ever. We might call some of these horrors unimaginable, were it not for the fact that Bosch had imagined them. These nightmare visions are, for many, the greatest achievement of Hieronymus Bosch. But with this visual representation of the Seven Deadly Sins, we see humour prevailing over horror. Created early in his career, the Seven Deadly Sins was painted in oils on a panel intended for use as a tabletop. Now in Madrid's Prado Museum, the work is dominated by a circle, whose center represents the eye of God, beholding the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. Below are the Latin words for "Beware, beware, God sees," which is unfortunate for the individuals depicted in the 7 major frames that comprise the outer circle. All of them are engaged in sin, with each frame representing a different transgression in a series of contemporary genre scenes. The message of each frame is clear. Here, anger is represented by an altercation between 2 men, whose obvious disagreement may well have been fueled by drink consumed in the background tavern. Similarly, it does not take long to establish that these pleasure-loving individuals are guilty of the sin of gluttony. But this circle of sin strikes the modern viewer as almost quaint in character, amusing rather than threatening. It may be that Bosch intended to evoke such a response from contemporary viewers.
Bosch was a moralist, and he was a moralist in some way obsessed by the devil. The devil for him was everywhere, the sins were everywhere, and this is in fact what he represented in his paintings. I mean, all the forms, the 7 deadly sins, for example, which is a major theme in his work, these were the sins which would take you to hell without a confession. I mean, certainly for him, that was the reality of the things. And he certainly would have believed that people were punished in hell, as he showed it, in fact, in one of his paintings, would be akin to the sins they would have done during life.
Bosch was very much like a medieval preacher, and these medieval preachers would actually tell anecdotal stories, funny stories, to keep the attention of the congregation. And in that way, I think he works just in the same way and tells things in possibly more humorous manner, but it all has a very moral purpose in the end.
It is only outside the center circle that the 7 deadly sins reveals the sense of menace that would characterize much of Bosch's greatest work. In the corners are 4 more circles depicting the so-called 4 last things of man: death, last judgment, heaven, and the ultimate destination of the sinner, hell. Unsurprisingly, this is not a pleasant scene, with sinners forced to endure punishments for the misdeeds of their lifetimes, as terrible fires rage in the background. Though effective in the context of the overall tabletop, this small image only hints at the horrors to come in the work of Hieronymus Bosch. Here we see another later image of the fires of hell, which again provide the background to the sufferings of the damned. Looking at this scene, we can begin to appreciate the kind of hellscape forever associated with Bosch. But we should also recognize that this is just one component of the complete work of art. It forms the right-hand panel of a series of 3 paintings. On the left is a scene of paradise, while the large central panel gives the whole piece its name: The Last Judgment. Time and again, Bosch executed his work in this 3-fold format, popular at the time: the triptych.
The triptych is kind of well-organized form of altarpiece all over Europe. You find it in Poland, you find it in Portugal, you find it in Italy, and you find it in the Netherlands. It has the great advantage of giving you a center picture which performs the business of the altarpiece, 2 wings which will often allow you to paint a portrait of the donor, or put in the donor's patron saints, or put in the patron saints of the church. And then during Lent, the lead-in to Easter, you close the thing, and on the back of the panels, you get, usually in grisaille, in paint which is grey in tonality, goes from black to white or dark grey to white. Figures which, again, have some relevance either to the donors or to the church, but are without colour. In other words, it's sombre, it reflects the mood of Lent, and it shuts away the great glory of the centre. The great glory of the centre isn't necessarily painted, it can be carved. Tilman Riemenschneider in Germany with a wonderful, great coloured altarpiece. And you simply shut it away with the wings. Then Easter comes, you drape it with black cloth, you will spend 24 hours celebrating Tenebrae on your knees, with all the windows darkened, and then you celebrate the ascension of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, by opening the doors. Everything is back to normal. You know. And there is a great theatrical thrill about this. Think of it in terms of opening up the light with windows, of inserts, bells and singing, and you get the theatre of the church. And that's why the triptych is the perfect form.
Bosch's triptychs are undoubtedly his best-known works. The left-to-right journey from heaven to hell can be seen in many of them. In this series, entitled The Haywain, the central panel again presents us with a scene whose subject matter appears innocent enough at first. The procession of a cart of hay. The scene is bright with blues and especially pinks, predating their use in the most famous Bosch of all, the Garden of Earthly Delights. We can also see a pleasant rolling landscape, providing the background to a scene of apparent frivolity. But this is an image loaded with visual symbols that would have been well understood in Bosch's time. Dutch folklore saw hay both as a symbol of man's pursuit of wealth and of the sinful follies that this pursuit entailed. The owl would also have been recognized as a symbol of heresy, while the vase referred to female promiscuity. But modern audiences can also share the sense of ungodliness that Bosch sought to convey. What is actually pulling the haywain? Whatever they are not creatures created by God. And what is the destination of this highly symbolic procession? The right panel of the triptych reveals the terrible truth. It is a place whose existence may be doubted by many today, but whose terrifying reality was fully accepted in medieval times. We are now in hell itself.
He concentrated on hell because his paintings are warning. They're warning to humanity not to take that way. And this is in fact how his paintings were seen.
Throughout the medieval period, it was impossible for the peasantry and the working classes, slightly different, and the middle classes to exist without having a constant awareness of the imminence of death. There were no doctors to speak of. There were only rudimentary remedies for any kind of illness, and something quite simple like measles or scarlet fever would carry you off. There was hunger, there was scurvy or teeth fell out. The average age of people was, at the time of death, was much earlier than it is now. It was common for people to get married at the age of 14, have children at once, and be dead by the time they were 24. You know, a short life, not a very merry one. They died of cold, they died of hunger, they died of scurvy, all kinds of deprivation. And so, if you look at medieval life and you look at the history of famine in medieval times right across Europe, you realize that death was always there. You have kind of allegorical things like the dances of death, the early form of illustration, continuing well into Renaissance times. The warning constantly that death awaits you whatever you do. You're the young, you're the old, you're male, female, you're sleeping, you're eating, whatever you're doing, death is always at your shoulder. With death, there is judgment, there is hell, there's purgatory, and there is heaven with a stroke of luck. And so it was a world of angels and devils all the time.
Images such as these remind us that the medieval mindset conceived of a tangible, physical hell, of eternal physical suffering. Many modern Christians place less emphasis on the reality of hell, choosing instead to define it philosophically as the absence of God. But if we were to imagine a real hell, we would surely conjure up a scene similar to this. It is not just the smoke and the fire and the physical suffering that makes this a fearful place. It is the sight of unfathomable creatures whose existence is as real as that of the unfortunate humans depicted here. Grotesque creatures are one of the most striking features of Bosch's work, as we can see in the terrifying central panel of the Last Judgment triptych. Bosch surely appreciated that it is the unknown that we fear most, and no one on earth can ever have witnessed creatures like these terrible hybrids of man and beast. More unsettling still is the fusion of the animate and the inanimate, as we can see with this surreal knife creature advancing purposefully in the bottom right of the panel. It is this sense of purpose that, for many, is the greatest artistic achievement of this horrifying scene. This is a world where purpose and agency are undoubtedly present. The monsters that we see here have objectives which do not appear out of place, given the context that Bosch has created. This is a world with its own internal order of things, an order we cannot fathom, other than with reference to the obvious human suffering. It is this totality of vision that makes the Last Judgment a disturbing image, even for those who consider the idea of hell absurd. It is unsurprising that many modern critics believe that Bosch must have been inspired by some kind of hallucinogenic stimulant.
Well, I think actually it wasn't necessary for Bosch because, again, there were so many of these fantastic monsters and devils around in the medieval world, all through the medieval world. And so he got inspiration from the margins of manuscripts, from, all around the churches, from the sculptures, and also carvings on misericords, and even the literature. There was a lot of mystic literature which was full of monstrous creations and symbols as well.
People have looked at Bosch in different ways. I mean, some people have, claimed he used hallucinogenic drugs. Some other people said that his work had a kind of alchemical meaning, an astrological meaning, and so on. There may be allusions, obviously, to astrology in his work, so there may be a figure which is akin to an astrological tradition, but that's not what his work is about. His work is first religious, secondly moral, and then, obviously, what makes it so great is the artist's invention, when, possibly because he didn't have so many formulas to follow, he had to invent them. He had to be creative, and this makes him one of the most interesting artists of his time.
We may never know for sure whether Bosch's artistic vision was stimulated by an altered state of consciousness. But we can be certain that the actual execution of his work was as painstaking as that of any other great painter of history. His surviving drawings prove that there was nothing slack or random about the detail of his paintings. This weird figure is known as the Tree Man, an incomprehensible being whose completed form we can see in the most famous of all Bosch's works. This is another image of hell which forms the right panel of another remarkable triptych, the Garden of Earthly Delights. It is likely that Bosch was in his early 50s when he painted this extraordinary work of art, which remains a defining image of the late Middle Ages. The central panel may be best known today, but the adjoining scenes of paradise and hell are scarcely less impressive. Again, the three panels take us on a left-to-right journey from the paradise of the creation to the fires of damnation, via an outdoor scene of feverish activity, the Garden of Earthly Delights itself. It is an entirely appropriate name. In the center of the panel, we see naked women bathing in an exotic garden pond, encircled by men riding a huge variety of animals. Behind them, we can see fantastic waterside constructions in pink and blue, while the left middle ground is notable for a collection of birds of disproportionate size. It requires time to take in fully the sheer amount of activity happening here. As with many of Bosch's works, this is an image heavy with symbolism. Again, much of the hidden meaning may be lost on the modern viewer, but it is not difficult to realize that the artist is dealing, once again, with the business of sin, specifically the sin of lust. Some details of the panel display this more or less overtly. Elsewhere, Bosch uses symbolism to make his message clear. Birds, fruit, and other devices have been identified as symbols of physical sexuality. The whole idea of a garden of love was derived from a well-established folk tradition, and this is a painting for which a knowledge of contemporary folklore adds immeasurably to our appreciation of the work. Although the Garden of Delights is heavy with symbolic meaning that may be obscure today, the ultimately bleak message of the triptych can be readily understood. The sinfulness of the central panel leads directly to the hell of the panel on the right. Here, once more, it is the sheer imaginative power of the artist that makes the horror effective. Looking closely at the detail here, it is difficult not to imagine some kind of hallucinogenic inspiration. When the eye travels over the 2 square meters of this one painting, it is a journey that requires many pauses to take in the scope of Bosch's imagination. The hideous ears with their terrifying blade, the harp transformed into a terrible instrument of torture, the lantern that has become a furnace, horrifying details that are themselves detailed. If we look at the bird figure to the bottom right, we see that he is swallowing the damned only to excrete them into a hole in the ground. Though horrifying, we may just be able to imagine such a hellish scene ourselves. But this is not all we see, and many of the smaller details simply defy explanation. Why is a human posterior excreting coins into the hole? Why is the bird creature wearing a cauldron on its head? Why are the ends of his humanoid legs shod with wine jars? Again, Bosch may have had symbolic meanings in mind, but even if he did, it is not essential for us to be aware of them. Instead, we can see these features as components of a contingent, imaginary world whose diabolic menace derives from its unfathomable nature. Quite literally, the devil is in the detail. The purpose of visual art is not to provide answers to the difficulties faced by mankind, and the Garden of Earthly Delights makes no attempt to do so, other than perhaps to shock the would-be sinner into a life of Christian virtue. Bosch's own faith is one of the few facts that have survived concerning his life, and much of the work of his later career was religious in nature. It is tempting to see this body of work as a spiritual counter to the horrors of his better-known art. We know that Bosch first used biblical subject matter in the early years of his career. This image of the Epiphany, or Adoration of the Magi, may date from as early as 1475. By contrast, this second version of the same subject could have been created some 40 years later, in the last period of the artist's life. Here we again see the often obscure details that characterize Bosch's work. But this is a very different kind of work from the famous hellscapes. It is almost a relief to consider quietly the visitation to the infant Jesus and admire one of the less widely appreciated aspects of Bosch's art, his mastery of landscape.
There seems to me to be a concerted attempt by a large number of scholars of Bosch to make him something that he was not. And one of these is a major painter of landscape. I find it very difficult to believe that a new school of landscape painting developed out of Bosch's paintings. And too few people saw them, too few people realized that there was a landscape element that was worth looking at. Too many of his pictures have entirely schematic landscapes, which have no relevance to the history of landscape painting. They have some relevance in the history of invention, but not of observation. He's entirely different from Bruegel, who is a really significant pusher on of the whole business of landscape painting. I have no doubt that he went and sat in the open air and drew trees. He may even have painted trees. There are wonderful trees in late painting like St. Anthony, which didn't come out of his head, which did come out of observation. But in general, I don't think he's at all significant. And pushing Patinir onto him as impossible without him seems to me to be nonsense.
We can still appreciate Bosch's skills as a landscapist in much of his religious work. Here we see St. Christopher carrying the infant Jesus against a wooded landscape stretching back into the hills. Much of Bosch's later work depicts events from the lives of the saints, often incorporating trademark symbolism to express these events visually. As elsewhere, much of this symbolism may not be immediately meaningful to the modern viewer. But with this image of St. John the Baptist in the wilderness, the identity of this creature as the Lamb of God is clear. Many of Bosch's religious paintings dealt with the subject of saints in the wilderness, exposed to the temptations of the devil. Few artists can ever have been better qualified for the task. Images such as these gave Bosch the opportunity to demonstrate his skills as a landscapist and his mastery of narrative. Much of this symbolism deployed may now be arcane, and there is no doubt that the lives of the saints were better known in the 16th century than they are today. But we can still appreciate the idea of the isolated Christian, adrift in a perplexing world with only faith to sustain him. One such individual was St. Anthony, an early believer who passed most of his days in the deserts of Egypt, living as a hermit. According to his hagiography, Anthony's privations included being beaten unconscious by devils in the tomb he used as a prayer house. He was also tempted by the devil in the form of a great queen, whose apparent benevolence and goodness was eventually revealed as the deceit of Satan. Both these narrative details can be seen in Bosch's triptych entitled The Temptation of St. Anthony. But this late work gives the viewer more than just the narrative. The theme of temptation by the devil allowed the artist to give full expression to the fantastic, notably in the middle panel, where we see the saint beside the tomb, surrounded by monstrous figures as the fires of hell rage once more in the background. As with earlier works, The Temptation of St. Anthony rewards the viewer prepared to explore the details incorporated into the scene. the wine jar turned into a pig-like creature, is an especially memorable example, but the St. Anthony triptych is, perhaps, best appreciated in its entirety. It is amongst the best preserved of all Bosch's works, and amongst the most technically accomplished of his career. The sense of temptation faced by the saint is expressed by the vividness of Bosch's colours. The lure of the devil must be dazzling, otherwise there is little achievement in renouncing it. In artistic terms, we can also see here Bosch's mastery of arrangement and of light. The treescape to the right of the burning town is as unsettling in its silent simplicity as are the more immediately horrifying details. In simple terms, The Temptation of St. Anthony is a mature work by an artist who had now reached the peak of his powers. The Temptation of St. Anthony may represent Bosch's finest technical achievement, but it remains primarily an expression of faith. One of the most remarkable details in any painting by Bosch can be seen within the tomb behind St. Anthony. There can be no doubting this eternal image. It is Christ himself on the cross. The figure is so small that first-time viewers of the work can fail to notice it at all. But once we become aware of its presence, it comes to inform the entire work with the Christian message of salvation. Christ would be the subject matter for most of the paintings that survive from the final years of Bosch's life, though, as we have seen, his earlier work includes also scenes from the life of Jesus. Ecce Homo, or Behold the Man, takes us back to the theme of folly. Here we see the moment when Jesus is condemned by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who is only carrying out the wishes of the mob. The suffering of Christ is masterfully rendered. We can clearly see the consequences of his scourging. But it is Christ's tormentors who are, perhaps, the real subject matter here. They are totally wrapped up in their own earthly existence. We can imagine that, for these individuals, this is just an ordinary, typical day. They have no idea at all of the real significance of their actions. This is the moment when Christ is most isolated, surrounded by folly, with only a terrible death to come. It is hardly surprising that the images of Jesus painted by Bosch concentrate on these final moments of the Saviour's life, the events of the Passion.
Bosch painted the Passion, but the Passion is the main subject of Christian imagery, so there's nothing really surprising in it. I mean, there are scenes which were chosen and codified, there were devotions which were linked to the sufferings of Christ. No, again, his interest in the Passion is a very traditional one.
I think because with the Passion, you could show Christ suffering at the hands of these human sinners to a much greater extent. And it's very much in line with a movement which was very popular in the 15th century called the modern devotion. And that movement taught meditation on the suffering of Christ, contemplation and also imitation. And so the sacrifice of Christ by meditating on it and concentrating on it would show up what Christ actually did for the redemption of humankind.
Surviving works by Bosch tell the familiar story of the final hours of Jesus Christ right up to the moment of his death. The finest of these can be considered the artist's final masterpiece, Christ carrying the cross. Here the folly of the mob can again be seen, but there is a far greater sense of gloating in the faces of these individuals than in the earlier Ecce Homo. They have got their wish now. Jesus is soon to die a terrible death. They are savouring the moment. The two criminals also condemned to die are not spared their malice. One of them appears to have some spirit of resistance left, but the other is now completely broken and resigned to his fate. But it is Christ himself that represents Bosch's greatest achievement here. Eyes closed, he is somehow apart from the chaos around him. For Christians, this is entirely appropriate. The person of Jesus has human and divine elements, and Bosch somehow captures both in his representations of the Christ figure. Christians also believe that Jesus triumphed over the folly of men with the achievement of his resurrection. But this is an image whose overall sense of pessimism cannot be denied. It is unfortunate that we have no record of the thoughts and beliefs of the artist who created it.
With Bosch, I think we have absolutely no idea how his mind works. We have no idea what kind of man he was at all. He may have been almost anything. He may have been, and I suspect, I mean, if you force me into a corner and say, what do you think he was like? My inclination is to say that in order to paint what he did and not cause outrage, he must have been extremely devout in his observances. He must have been a religious and not a bitter and twisted old man whom everybody disliked. He must have been deeply respected, which suggests to me that he was serious in all his endeavors, and that his personality, whatever it was, is not allowed to come through.
Hieronymus Bosch, the man, will probably remain a mystery forever. But his work is amongst the most recognizable of all Western art. By the time of his death, in August 1516, his achievements were undeniable, and the following decades saw his work become the best known of any artist of the Netherlands. Centuries later, his work proved inspirational to the Surrealists, and much of his work remains as relevant today as it has ever been. But in artistic terms, the work of Hieronymus Bosch would most strongly influence the work of a painter born in the decade after his death, Pieter Bruegel the Elder, the second of the Dutch masters.